So what we end up now is in a scenario where any and every industry becomes the scapegoat for the government, that the government pretends that they have no control, no capacity to be able to change the things that will change your life, despite the fact that something as simple, yet in my opinion, as profound as petrol tax is a decision that they could make tomorrow. But they choose not to. So instead what we have is, of course, the great sport of bank bashing now being appropriated to other industries. Industries that employ a lot of people, that pay an awful lot of tax. Now, we've seen this play before, because when interest rates went up in May of 2022, it was all one person's fault.
We think that the difference between Labor and the government is the government's trying to wash their hands of this challenge. You know, they don't understand the pressure that people are under Scott Morrison's cost of living crisis, and we do. And there are things that governments need to be focused on. Growing the economy without adding to inflation, getting real wages moving again, trying to have something to show from this budget, which is heaving with $1 trillion in debt.
But of course, that was just one interest rate rise. An entire dozen of them have happened since, meaning that the squeeze on the suburban family is the worst it's been since the 90s. Forget the Asian GFC. This is a serious amount of strain that's happening on families right now. We talk about it every night. Yet what did this government do? Rather than trying to have policies that would cut government spending, so that they would do their bit to be able to pull back on inflation, because the government pumping money in the way that it does, including with more than 36% of the entire federal budget being welfare, not to mention billions and billions of dollars in being spent off budget, but spent on infrastructure that, as the IMF has told us before, just like with state government, also pushes up inflation. This government turned around and sent the message out that it wasn't them. It wasn't even the Reserve Bank. It was just one public servant who was the reason interest rates kept rising.
I think there's no doubt that Philip Lowe should go. I would say the government reappointing Philip Lowe would be an endorsement of the myriad failures.
Half of all Australians believe the Reserve Bank boss, Philip Lowe, should lose his job.
Angry politicians will have very pointed questions to fire at him on behalf of even angrier mortgage holders.
But what he can't stop, rising rage over interest rate hikes.
52% of Aussies saying Phil Lowe should not keep his job.
It was an extraordinary hit job. It was a hit job that was all about making it seem like one person who has one lever to pull and was the only person pulling a lever because the government wasn't pulling any levers that it possibly could. Instead, it was being kissed on the forehead by a huge amount of money coming in via the mining sector, meaning they were able to make a budget look good, despite the fact that the reality of the budget is that structurally it is in deep deficit for the next 40 years, meaning their plan is to spend and spend more than they earn for the next 40 years. And it worked. The government was never held accountable. Remember, we had entire election cycles where one of the reasons why John Howard's political fortunes changed between 2004 and 2007 was a promise on keeping interest rates low. As soon as they started to tick up, that was the reason to change the government. This was a government that promised to keep cost of living low if you elected them. Yet by any and every indices, it's all kept going up. I don't know, but it was Philip Lowe who was the biggest problem in the Australian economy. So, of course, he got the heave-ho. His deputy was appointed by the Prime Minister and by the Treasurer to become the new governor of the Reserve Bank. But she ended up also lifting interest rates because of the failure of the government to actually do anything about many of the things we talk about on this show all day, every day. So then they came up with a plan to try to rig the Reserve Bank. Reform the Reserve Bank, to strengthen and modernise the Reserve Bank. This is where they would have fewer meetings, where more people, an entirely separate, hand-picked group by this government, would have people friendly to them, meaning that if it was time to put them down, they'll put them down harder and faster, and if it's time to put them up, they wait longer and go slower, because it all helps their political fortunes, you see. So their suggestion, just like the meme, job done. But of course, it wasn't a job done, because interest rates for multiple months have stayed in exactly the same place, because all of the fundamentals that meant that they kept going up and the squeeze was still needed because the government wasn't showing the restraint, so it was going to force householders to take the pill. It now means that since this government came to office, if you have a mortgage of $500,000, you have had to find an extra $14,000. Where from? If you're on $750,000, like the average loan in Australia, you've had to find an extra $21,000. Where from? If people, like many in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, but certainly lots of other parts around the country, are on more than $1 million of a mortgage, you've had to find $30,000. Now, this is all not funny money. And you haven't got a pay rise of $14,000, $21,000 or $29,000. Yet the politicians who failed to make the serious decisions, well, they got their biggest pay rise in 10 years. The bureaucrats, who of course make life so difficult for business, they also got their biggest pay rise in 10 years. And even if they're able to successfully rig the Reserve Bank and start to put people in place to make the decisions that they want them to make, to start to bring things down, have a look at this. This is the Reserve Bank's official predictions of maybe when things start turning. Well, nothing really changes until maybe towards the end of this year, and then 25, the middle and end of the year, best case scenario, will be about a point down from where we are now in June of 2026. And even if that's the case, you will still be paying 76% of the interest rate increases that you are paying today since Albo became Prime Minister. There is no financially better off that is coming before the next election. If you are trying to pay off a house, even if it starts to go the way they hope it goes, you will still be paying 3/4 of the dozen Albo interest rate rises. But it was all Philip Lowe's fault. And today we see that supermarkets are now going to be put into the same position as banks have been, specifically the Reserve Bank. Now, we of course know there was a Banking Royal Commission, yet branches still continue to close, profits still continue to go up, all of the bad issues with banks continue. And you see, the scapegoat that was for interest rates was Philip Lowe. The scapegoat for cost of living is apparently the people who sell the stuff that you buy to feed your family.
My government is concerned about the price of what consumers pay at Coles and Woolies and other supermarkets. We want to make sure that consumers benefit from cheaper prices which are being paid. We're dead serious. We find it completely unacceptable that when supermarkets are getting goods cheaper, the prices should go down.
So who did they call in? Well, as always, there's a job for a mate, despite the fact that this was definitely not the government that was going to do that. Dr. Craig Emerson, who at one point in time was a fair trading minister or something like that, he literally had responsibility for Grocery Watch way back in the Rudd and Gillard years. He, in fact, ended up having to wind it up. So he was the one who got called in, and he's the one who's now declared that what is currently a voluntary code of conduct will become a compulsory code of conduct. And if the supermarkets do the wrong thing with their suppliers, well, this is what's going to happen.
That could be either fines of $10 million, 10% of a company's turnover, or 3 times the benefit gained from breaches of the code.
Now, whether this will actually happen or not, who knows? But interestingly, this is not calculated on profit. This is calculated on turnover. This is the fuzzy maths that the Greens use to introduce taxation. Now, at the end of the day, regardless of what business it is, be it a small news agent, the 4 that still exist, your local real estate agent, or something as big as the big supermarkets, all that matters is profit, not turnover. But if the penalties are going to be linked to turnover, well, again, we're in a new form of fuzzy math. But again, all of this doesn't matter, because it doesn't matter whether they are or aren't doing the wrong thing. It's all about them being able to be blamed, not the government who of course makes a series of policy decisions which in part affect what is sold in each and all of those stores. And in the end, the government's happy because this is how the news story gets introduced. And for a lot of people who were doing something else while the Channel 10 news was on, they just hear the start of it. And the start of it couldn't have been written better by Albo himself.
A mandatory code of conduct for major supermarkets will lead to cheaper prices at the checkout and a fairer go for farmers.
Honestly. Now, the reality of all capitalism is that once eventually you start getting down to only one or two major players, then yes, you end up in a relatively unhealthy position. Competition is always better because, as we've seen with, say, airlines, and even then there's not enough, it starts to bring down the prices. It starts to create better offers for the consumer. But the idea now that supermarkets are going to be treated in the same fashion as which the former head of the Reserve Bank is, as if it's all their problem and it's nothing to do with government policy. Now, I would believe that if the government wasn't doing anything to make things more expensive, not just in a supermarket, but in every shop in Australia. And that's exactly what they're doing. You see, last year in the budget, they introduced new taxation on heavy vehicles. Of course, all connected to do with climate change. But if that means that regardless of what price you've been able to negotiate between the supermarket and the farmer, for it to be driven from the farmer to the port to the warehouse to the shop, all of it's going to cost more because of the taxation the government's been put in place. If the government took that tax away, then okay, they'd be able to blame the end operator, that being the supermarket, but instead, it's just another bogeyman and another person to be the fall guy. Another person to pretend that this government is only responsible when anything goes good. When anything goes bad, it's because of the bad actors that are in all of the other places other than the great place of government. Now, if anything does result in cheaper things, then I'll be more than happy. But I don't think it is going to result in that, and you know that too. The only thing that I do like is in part of this principle is that if a local farmer does want to take on a major supermarket, well, they will not be able to be retaliated against if they do so. That's good, but you don't need that in the mandatory version of the code. Just another fall guy. And yet again, the media falls for it or helps fall for it in exactly the same way they did when it came to interest rates, when the government plays a role. But in this case, nothing at all, apparently.